Many people think that Papua New Guinea's history began in 1975, when it gained independence from Australia. But no, its story goes back much further than that. In today's video, we'll travel back to the colonial era and explore what life was like in PNG before it was Papua New Guinea. Make sure to stick around until the end of the video, because I'll be sharing some photos and videos that will transport you back in time. So let's get started. In 1884, Germany established a small trading post on the northern coast of the island of New Guinea. This marked the beginning of European involvement in the region and would eventually lead to the country being split between two colonial powers, Germany and the Dutch. However, the Germans were the first to establish a formal colony on the island, when they annexed the area around their trading post and declared it German New Guinea. At this point, the indigenous people had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. The colonial era in German New Guinea lasted for just over 30 years, from 1884 to 1914. During this time, the Germans implemented policies aimed at exploiting the natural resources of the territory and suppressing any form of uprising or resistance. From the local population, they introduced cash crops such as coffee and cocoa and exploited the vast forest resources for timber. The main industries in German New Guinea were agriculture and mining. The German colonial administration focused on producing export crops such as coffee, cocoa, rubber, and copra, which is the dried meat of coconuts. They also exploited the mineral resources of the territory, including gold, copper, and silver. The focus on resource extraction rather than manufacturing meant that most of the value added by these industries went to German merchants and industrialists, rather than to the colonial government or the local population. Despite the introduction of cash crops and other development projects, the standard of living for the indigenous people did not improve significantly during the German colonial period. In fact, it probably got worse. Many indigenous people were forced to work on plantations or in mines under harsh conditions for low pay, and the German administration was generally indifferent to their welfare. The colonial government was also repressive and did not tolerate any form of dissent or resistance. The Germans employed a system of indirect rule through local chiefs, but they also used force and intimidation to maintain control. They built a small military presence in German New Guinea, including a coastal defense force and a small number of troops stationed in key towns. This military force was mainly used to suppress any form of rebellion or uprising by the indigenous population. But it wasn't all bad news for the locals. Some positive aspects of German colonial rule include the introduction of modern medicine, which helped to reduce the spread of infectious diseases, and the establishment of schools and churches, which provided education and religious instruction to the indigenous population. However, these benefits were limited to a small minority of the population, mainly those who lived in urban areas and had access to colonial services. The vast majority of the indigenous population remained isolated and cut off from the benefits of colonial rule. The First World War marked a turning point in the history of German New Guinea. In 1914, Australia invaded and quickly overwhelmed the small German military force present in the territory. After the war, the League of Nations awarded Australia a mandate to administer German New Guinea, which included the northern part of the island of New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomon Islands. This marked the beginning of Australian rule in Papua New Guinea, which would last for over 60 years. During the early years of Australian administration, the focus was on establishing control over the territory and suppressing any potential threats to the new colonial order. The Australian government viewed the indigenous population with suspicion and fear, and there were several incidents of violence and repression. For example, in 1922, an uprising by the indigenous population in the Highlands region was brutally suppressed by the Australian authorities. However, over time, the Australian administration became more confident in its control over the territory and began to focus on development and economic growth. They implemented policies aimed at promoting agriculture, mining, and trade, and they also invested in infrastructure projects such as roads and airstrips. These policies were generally successful, and Papua New Guinea experienced significant economic growth during the interwar period. But then came World War II, which had a devastating impact on the territory. In 1942, Japanese forces invaded and occupied much of northern Papua New Guinea. This led to widespread destruction and loss of life. and the war effort also drained the Australian government's resources and made it difficult to provide basic services to the population. It wasn't until 1945 that the Japanese were finally driven out of Papua New Guinea. The war had a profound impact on the territory and its people, and the legacy of this period can still be felt today. However, after the war, the Australian government was determined to rebuild Papua New Guinea and set about the task with a combination of urgency and efficiency. The focus was on restoring essential services such as healthcare and education, as well as on rebuilding infrastructure that had been damaged during the war. This involved a massive effort to clear the territory of Japanese troops and then to repair roads, bridges, and other essential infrastructure. At the same time, the Australian government also needed to address the social and economic needs of the population. Many people had been killed or injured during the war, and there was a need to provide medical care and rehabilitation services. Additionally, the war had disrupted the economy and caused widespread poverty, so the government also needed to implement policies to promote economic recovery. One of the main challenges facing the Australian government was the need to balance the needs of the indigenous population with those of the returning Australian soldiers and settlers. There was a risk that the indigenous population would be marginalised and excluded from the benefits of the post-war era. But the government took steps to ensure that this did not happen. For example, they introduced policies to promote education and healthcare among the indigenous population, and they also encouraged their participation in politics and government. Despite these efforts, however, the indigenous population continued to face discrimination and inequality, and it would be many years before these issues were fully addressed. In the aftermath of World War II, there was a growing movement for independence and self-determination among the indigenous population of Papua New Guinea. This was driven by a number of factors, including the experience of war and occupation, the desire for greater political and economic rights, and the influence of nationalist movements in other parts of the world. As the movement for independence grew, the Australian government was faced with a difficult choice: either grant Papua New Guinea independence or risk losing control of the territory. Ultimately, they chose to grant independence, and Papua New Guinea became a sovereign nation on September 16, 1975. Colonialism has had a profound and lasting impact on Papua New Guinea, shaping its history, economy, and society in many ways. One of the most significant impacts of colonialism was the introduction of cash crops and the exploitation of natural resources. The colonial administration focused on extracting resources such as timber, gold, and coffee, which brought wealth to colonial rulers but did not benefit the local population. This extractive economy continues to shape Papua New Guinea today, where resource extraction remains a major part of the economy. Another impact of colonialism was the introduction of Western education and religion. The colonial administration established schools and churches, which provided education and religious instruction to the indigenous population. While this had some positive aspects, it also served to undermine traditional beliefs and practices. This process of cultural assimilation is still evident in Papua New Guinea today, where Christianity is the dominant religion and English is the official language. Perhaps the most significant impact of colonialism in Papua New Guinea is the legacy of inequality and discrimination. The colonial administration viewed the indigenous population with suspicion and implemented policies that favored returning Australian soldiers and settlers. This created a deep social and economic divide that persists to this day. Despite efforts to promote equality and self-determination, Papua New Guinea continues to grapple with the legacy of colonialism and its impact on its people. It's important to note that colonialism was not a monolithic phenomenon, and the experiences of Papua New Guinea under German and Australian rule differed in significant ways. Under German rule, the focus was on extracting resources and suppressing any form of resistance, while under Australian rule, the emphasis was on economic growth and development. Both periods had a profound impact on Papua New Guinea and its people, and the legacy of this history is still evident today. Overall, colonialism in Papua New Guinea was a complex and controversial period that had a profound impact on the country and its people. While there were some positive aspects to colonial rule, such as the introduction of Western education and healthcare, the negative impacts of colonialism are still evident today. The exploitation of natural resources, the suppression of indigenous cultures, and the legacy of inequality and discrimination continue to be felt in Papua New Guinea today. If you want to learn more about PNG, make sure to check out my other videos about the country. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.